Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. We were standing in the room there. It got really quiet out here. We realized we better get out here quick. I'm Dr. Jeff Gingrich. I'm the interim provost and vice president for academic affairs, and I want to thank everyone for coming out today. This is a great group. You're in for a real treat this afternoon. I want to particularly thank the faculty who brought your classes here today. This has been a day that we've been looking forward to for quite some time. When we heard that Cornell Brooks would be available to come to be with us, to spend a day with us, we've been very excited for a while. For those of you who don't know, this is our Executive in Residence Day of the Nerney Leadership Institute. A little over about a year and a half ago, we started the Nerney Leadership Institute with the generous funding of our chair of our board of trustees and alum, Tom Nerney, to establish a place where we could think about leadership in a new way, in new ideas about leadership, and not just focusing on leadership in terms of controlling others, achieving goals, although we want to achieve goals as well, but really thinking about leadership where we first think about ourselves and how we lead ourselves, and then using that as the basis for helping to lead others. Looking at leadership in terms of justice, fairness, and solidarity with the marginalized. And so our executive in residence have been these days where we bring the leaders in society who truly model the kind of leadership we're talking about. And with Cornell Brooks, we feel like that's an exemplary model of the kinds of leadership that we envision and that we want to talk about when we talk about leadership. I was asked to begin with a reflection today, and I'm going to take a little bit of a different tact and use a poem by Langston Hughes, one of the greatest poets in America. Many of you have heard this. This is a short poem called A Dream Deferred. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? The United States of America would be a different country if it were not for the work of the NAACP. And there's not a lot of organizations you can say that about. For 160 years, the NAACP has been working tirelessly to work on dreams, as the poem refers to. First, they work to ensure that as many dreams as possible can blossom and flourish so that they do not need to be deferred. But the NAACP is also there when those dreams that have been deferred by injustice, by racism, by fear, do explode. They are there in moments of crisis and confusion to make things make sense and to renew the dream and to replant the dream. This past year, we've experienced a sad and frightening amount of incidents in America that show us that we still have a long journey before we reach true equality and justice for all. It has shown us the continued importance of the NAACP for the lifeblood of American freedom. Cabrini College and Nerney Leadership Institute is also about dream making, and we are proud to host today the leader of the NAACP and to partner with this great organization to make sure that as many dreams as possible are not deferred. Thank you for all being here today. I'd now like to invite Dr. Darrell Mace, Chair and Associate Professor of our History and Political Science Department, to introduce our esteemed speaker. Dr. Mace.
Thank you, Dr. Gingrich. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Cabrini College for the Nerney Leadership Institute's Executive in Residence program, honoring President and CEO of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Cornell Brooks. As Dr. Gingrich said, my name is Dr. Darrell Mace. I'm Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of History and Political Science here at Cabrini College, and it is my distinct honor to serve as the presider for this momentous program. Mr. Brooks has a long and storied history of accomplishments in community outreach and community engagement. His biography, which you can find on the inside cover of your program, Exhibit A. Speaks to the wide-ranging impact in the areas of civil rights, the law, and equal access and opportunity. Mr. Brooks is truly a fitting example of the power and reach of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the oldest and most well-known civil rights organization in the country. Mr. Brooks' predecessors include the likes of James Weldon Johnson, Roy Wilkins, Walter White, and Murley Evers Williams. Not only is Mr. Brooks a model of the type and style of leader that would head the NAACP, but his work makes him a logical selection to serve as an executive in residence here at Cabrini College, an institution named for the patroness of immigrants, St. Francis Xavier Cabrini, and an institution that is dedicated to social justice and grounded in the motto of service beyond oneself. Living out this credo, faculty, staff, and students, alumni, trustees, administrators, and friends of the college engage regularly in efforts that advance the common good. Our social justice curriculum places social ills front and center as faculty, staff, and students work alongside one another and in solidarity with community partners to address real-world issues. Throughout his life, Mr. Brooks has been deeply engaged in these same efforts, and there are many striking comparisons to his work and the work of the Cabrini community. Mr. Brooks spearheaded efforts for prisoner reentry reform, an issue that is near and dear to the heart of our provost, Dr. Gingrich, that is deeply connected to the work of our friend of the college and community partner, Carla Clanan, founder of In His Eyes Outreach, and a nonprofit organization working on prisoner reentry in Norristown, and an issue that has raised the passion of several of our faculty members who now teach Inside Out courses as part of our core Engagements with the Common Good course series. As another example of these connections, Mr. Brooks has long worked on fair housing issues. These are issues that are often rooted in problems of social economics, access to resources, and even poverty and homelessness. Cabrini College faculty, staff, and administrators have explored many of these issues, particularly as they relate to homelessness. And the college selected as its freshman summer reading Almost Home, a book that is full of vignettes from people who have experienced homelessness. And our last faculty Mission Academy engaged in direct service work around issues of homelessness in Philadelphia. These are but two examples of the links between the work of our executive in residence and the social justice outreach of Cabrini College. For Mr. Brooks, as for many members of the Cabrini community, these outreach efforts are deeply rooted in faith. Just as we at Cabrini follow the model of charism, if not always the religious practices of Mother Cabrini and our founding order, the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, Mr. Brooks finds a strength and a drive as an ordained minister and member of the African Methodist Episcopal faith tradition. Today, Mr. Brooks is here to talk about and dialogue around some of the pressing issues that we have faced as a nation over the past several months. These have been difficult issues to discuss, and even more difficult images to see on our television screens and hear about in our radio broadcast. However, we must face difficult issues and sustain dialogue if we are going to effect change. While the faith tradition of members of the Cabrini College community often differ, and many also differ from those of Mr. Brooks, we can all agree that our traditions drive us to stamp out injustice and inequality in our communities and across the globe. With a mindful embracing of the power of interfaith collaboration, we will continue to see real and sustainable change in our society. It is now my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce Mr. Cornell Brooks, President and CEO of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and NERNI Leadership Institute Executive in Residence.
Good afternoon. Now, because I'm executive in residence at Cabrini College, and I'm so happy to be here, I'm going to say good afternoon. I want you to say it like you're just extraordinarily happy to be here. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right. I know I'm in the right place. As a son of a very Southern grandmother, I was always taught to begin any occasion with these two very important words. Those words being thank you. I want to extend a word of appreciation to Tom Nerney, the founder of the Nerney Leadership Institute and the chairman of the board, to President Don Taylor, who made me feel so extraordinarily welcome this morning, and to my friend, Maria Viscarando, who was a founding trustee of an organization that I had the privilege of serving for nearly 7 years in Newark, New Jersey, and who serves as the Leadership Institute's executive director, and who is yet missed in New Jersey, even as much as you appreciate her here. I also want to extend a word of appreciation to our sponsors. Now, generally speaking, I travel to any number of events, and the sponsors are sometimes thanked at the very end. And these are the people who make these occasions possible. They feed us well, and they ensure that we're able to do these things. So I just want you to just take note of the people who support the work that we're doing here. Brown & Brown, the Bryn Mawr Hospital, the Mainline Health System, the Haverford Trust Company, and TD Bank. I also want to thank the members of the Nerney Leadership Advisory Council, Cabrini trustees, alumni, students, that would be all of you, the most important people here, and the faculty, some of whom I've had the chance to meet this morning, and any and all distinguished guests here today. Also want to extend a word of appreciation to, I believe, Pennsylvania State Rep. Santoro, if he is here on the first row. Would that be you? You look official. Oh, he'll be here this evening. And I understand that Mayor Nutter is en route as well. I want to share with you as colleagues, and I hope I can call you that as your executive in residence, that I'm just extraordinarily happy to be in the midst of such a distinguished and august group of people. Now, I have to share with you, as a civil rights lawyer and a fourth-generation ordained minister in the AME Church, it has not always been my privilege to be in the midst of so many distinguished people. There have been occasions when I've been in very difficult places. I can think of a time, this is a true story, where I found myself as a young man, a young, innocent, and naive preacher, in London, England, on a Sunday morning, standing outside of this beautiful Gothic cathedral with spires soaring up toward the heavens, these beautiful multi-hued, multicolored, iridescent stained glass windows. And as a young, naive, presumptuous preacher, I stood outside of this beautiful church, and I suppose that there were about 2,000 or so people inside waiting to hear this young, naive, presumptuous preacher preach. And I made my way inside of the sanctuary, and I immediately noticed the obvious: the pastor and exactly 2 members. True story. One member I'll call Miss Jones, and the other member I'll call Miss Smith. Now, I made my way to the pulpit, and I did as I was taught to do, which is to say that you speak, you share, you preach to 2 people in the same way that you would to 2,000, with sincerity, with conviction, with a sense of the heart. And so as I was speaking and preaching, I immediately noticed the obvious, that Miss Jones immediately fell asleep. True story. But as I was speaking, as I was preaching my heart out, I immediately noticed the obvious, that Miss Smith seemed to hang on to every word I had to say. She tapped her feet, she clapped her hands, and in my theological tradition, she said hallelujah and amen at all the right moments. And I thought to myself, at least I'm reaching somebody this Sunday morning. Well, I made my way out of the pulpit, made my way to the side of the pastor, and the pastor said to me, "Brother Brooks, I'm so sorry. Miss Jones, she falls asleep on everybody. And Miss Smith, she's out of her mind and did not understand the thing you had to say." So I'm delighted to be in the midst of such an august and distinguished audience, wide awake and presumably in your right minds. My topic this afternoon is civil rights in America, from Selma to Ferguson, captives or creators of history. We're mindful as we sit on this bucolic campus at this particular moment in our American history that we are literally at a crossroads of hope and history, contemporary circumstances and challenges. 50 years after a brave band of freedom fighters, otherwise known as the NAACP, so well represented here on this front row with our leadership and membership of the local NAACP. 50 years later, after this brave band of freedom fighters and Americans of various hues and heritage trudged down highways and byways, blood-soaked highways and sweat-stained byways and highways of the Deep South, seeking to realize the aspirations of the American Constitution in the form of the right to vote. 50 years after Bloody Sunday, a day remembered not merely as a Sabbath day in which parishioners acknowledge their Father who art in heaven, but our Father who art in heaven, his children being beaten to the ground on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. 50 years later, after we remember the legacy and the life, the work, and the worship of Jimmy Lee Jackson, who lost his life 50 years ago. 50 years later, on this anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, where we find ourselves uncomfortably situated between the past and the present. 50 years later, when we found ourselves watching an African-American president standing tall, standing erect on a bridge called the Edmund Pettus Bridge, seeing Barack Obama on one side of that bridge with a woman by the name Mrs. Amelia Boynton on the other side of that bridge. Barack Obama being in his 50s on the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act and Bloody Sunday, and Miss Amelia Boynton being 105 years old. He representing the present and the future, she representing the past and the future. 50 years later, on this Cabrini campus, we find ourselves at a particular moment in history. We find ourselves in the midst of a Shakespearean season in which young people all across the country, from Ferguson, from Staten Island, from Los Angeles and Washington, all asserting with their limbs, with their bodies, with their lives, with their lips, we are now in a moment in which young people assert, now is the winter of our discontent. We find ourselves at a moment in history, in the wake of the Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court decision, in which our Supreme Court invalidated Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act, rendering the Voting Rights Act a near legal nullity in terms of its effectiveness. 50 years later, we find ourselves in a moment in which state legislatures all across the country have engaged in a Machiavellian frenzy of disenfranchisement. 50 years later, we find ourselves at a moment in American history where we have young people your age posing the question, what's wrong with our criminal justice system when it seems to be characterized by criminal injustice? What happens 50 years later when we on college campuses read the words of Fyodor Dostoevsky and recall his novel Crime and Punishment, when it seems so often that we have people experiencing punishment as a crime? 50 years later, we are at a moment in American history between the past and the present. we are at a moment that might be described and has been described by some scholars, some commentators, and some students as the precipice of a third Reconstruction. So we think about the first Reconstruction in the 1860s and 1870s. African Americans found themselves on a horizon of hope, saw the sun of new possibilities rising on the horizon, and in the wake of the embers and the ashes of the Civil War, they grasped the franchise. And in the span of but a few moments of American history, nearly 8,000 African Americans were elected to office all across the South. In a few moments of American history, African Americans and others began to pass laws to change and transform state legislatures, not only for the benefit of African Americans, but for the benefit of Americans of all hues and heritage. What happened during this time? We saw that African Americans passed laws making public education more accessible, making it easier for the lives and plight of women in the Deep South. In that moment, we saw possibilities. We saw hope break upon the horizon, and yet in the wake of that Reconstruction movement, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, the Reconstruction Act of 1866, in the wake of that moment, a door closed and the right to vote was severely constrained. The possibilities of American voters evaporated and were eviscerated in mere moments. In the wake of that period of Reconstruction, what happened? A period of penal servitude described by Douglas Blackman in the book Slavery by Another Name, when unemployment was penalized, when loitering was penalized, and we created this system in which so many men across the South were relegated to the dungeons of this primitive criminal justice system, and then their bodies, their lives, and their livelihood was rented out. A moment in which we move forward and yet move backward. That second Reconstruction in the 1950s and 1960s. In the wake of Truman's order to desegregate the military, those of you of a certain age who have fathers or grandfathers, mothers or grandfathers who yet remember what it was like to live in a segregated society and wear the uniform and to swear allegiance to the flag and yet be relegated to second-class status, those who yet remember what it was like to have an executive order to declare that if you wear the uniform, you cannot be segregated while wearing the uniform and serving your country. And then only a few moments later, we had the Brown versus Board of Education decision in which we, as a nation, following a band of lawyers led by Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP, thought we were driving a knife through the heart of Jim Crow and bringing to an end the era of separate but equal. We had a heart full of possibilities and hope. And in the span of but a few years, passed the Voting Rights Act, passed the Fair Employment Act, passed the Fair Employment Act or Fair Housing Act. And we saw this whole world of possibilities and hope break forth. And we as a nation thought we were striving forward. And then we saw the election of an African-American president. And we had the moral audacity, with our sense of hope as Americans, to yet declare a post-racial America. And yet we are ever mindful as Americans that we seem to operate in a moral and civic and democratic universe where there's a Newtonian law of justice at work. And that law being this: for every act of justice, there seems to be an equal and opposite reaction of injustice. And so here we are, in the wake of that second Reconstruction. What happened? We had the Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court decision this Machiavellian frenzy of voter disenfranchisement all across the country. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of voters who find it difficult to realize the franchise. What do we mean? In the great state of Texas, an ID that is deemed civically and democratically sufficient to carry a concealed weapon empowers you to vote. But an ID that allows you to carry a book of Shakespeare, to carry a book of engineering, to carry a book of physics, to carry a book of chemistry, a ID that allows you to carry a college textbook is deemed democratically and civically insufficient to allow you to vote under state law in Texas. Lest we think that Texas is some kind of democratic and civic aberration in our constitutional democracy, all we need do is look at the state of North Carolina, which in the wake of the Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court decision passed an omnibus bill of disenfranchisement. How so? You being college students, I knew you were going to ask that question. When you have a form of ID that allows you to walk across a great military installation like Camp Lejeune, or Fort Bragg, or Fort Jackson, that form of ID is deemed civically and democratically sufficient that allows you to vote. But an ID that allows you to walk across the campus of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, or North Carolina State University, or Duke University is deemed insufficient. Something is profoundly wrong. Unless you think that I, as a lawyer, am worried about this as a matter of jurisprudence only. May I share with you a bit of biography that might help you understand why I think this is so important, and so important for you as college students. My mother, when she was your age, she went to college at 16, and she was a fashionable young lady, by her own report. About 5 feet, 2 inches or so tall, as she tells me, maybe 105 pounds at the time, and given to walking and wearing clothes fashionably. She told me that one of those people who are very much opposed to her asserting her rights under the American Constitution, she attended a civil rights march, and my mother being my mother, she was at the front of the march, wearing a very fashionable coat. And she tells me that those opposing her rights had the temerity to use a fire hose against her and ruin her coat. She doesn't remember being knocked to the ground, she remembers losing the coat. But my mother marched for her rights as a college student, the right to live wherever you can afford, to hold a job that you're qualified for, and to vote. She did that 50 years ago as a young African-American woman. Here she is 50 years later. She can't march now. She can't walk well now. She has multiple sclerosis now. She uses a walker now. She uses a wheelchair now. And she calls me up from Atlanta, Georgia, where they have voter ID laws, where there's much discussion about how to disenfranchise people, where the Secretary of State lost 40,000 voter registrations. She calls me up from that state, and she says to me, Cornell, you're a civil rights lawyer. You went to Yale Law School. I can't find my passport. I can't find my ID. What am I to do? I say to you, if it was wrong to keep somebody from voting 50 years ago as a consequence of race or ethnicity, it's wrong to keep them from voting as a consequence of their disability, as a consequence of a handicap, as a consequence of age. It was wrong then, it is wrong now. We're at a peculiar moment in American history. But as in the first Reconstruction, we saw a period of penal servitude. In the wake of this second Reconstruction, we see what Michelle Alexander described in her book, The New Jim Crow, a period of mass incarceration. Interesting that in the wake of these two reconstructions, we see a rollback of the right to vote and a rollback of the right to walk freely, unincarcerated, uncriminalized, unvictimized by the criminal justice system. What do we have now at this moment in American history? 2.3 million Americans behind bars, 1 out of every 4 adults with a criminal record, 65 million Americans with a criminal record, 1 out of every 3 young people being arrested by the age of 23, a person with a record of incarceration losing $100,000 in their prime earning years, a criminal justice problem of such size, such sweep, such scope that it costs our economy $53 billion a year. Unless you think that this is a problem for them somewhere else in some other community, I might remind you that this is a multi-hued, multi-ethnic, multi-racial challenge, the likes of which we cannot ignore. Here we are at this peculiar moment in history, possibly a third Reconstruction. And so we ask ourselves this afternoon at Cabrini College, what exactly will we do? Will we be co-creators of history or mere captives of history, swept along by the tide of inevitability, overwhelmed in a sea of fatalistic conclusions as to what we can do and what our possibilities are? Or will we live out the credo, the mission, the history of this college that is dedicated and predicated to the notion that social justice can be made real? I'd like to suggest to you that if history is any indication, if your presence here today is any indication, we will rise up and we will be co-creators, fashioners of our own history. We will take the pen of history and write a new conclusion, write the tale of a third Reconstruction. Why? Because we're well able to do that. Now you say to me, wait a minute, are students capable of this kind of advocacy? May I share with you a story about a woman by the name of Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray was a student at Howard University Law School, not too much older than you are now. She had the temerity, the moral boldness to suggest to her august, esteemed, and more experienced professors that we can bring separate but equal to an end in a generation. And then she had the guts, some of you who know what it's like to crank out a term paper at the last minute. Now, I know nobody here understands that, but that was my life as a student. Last minute, late at night, much caffeine. She wrote a paper outlining a strategy of defeating separate but equal. Turned the paper into a book. Thurgood Marshall referred to it as the Bible of state segregation laws. It was used as a roadmap to Brown versus Board of Education. They relied on the scholarship of a student to turn the table of American history. That's what you're capable of. Now, lest you think that her activism was relegated to her student days. This same woman graduated at the top of her class at a time when women were not recognized. She was entitled to a scholarship to Harvard Law School. The President of the United States intervened on her behalf, but because she was a woman, she couldn't get the scholarship. Eleanor Roosevelt intervened on her behalf as the First Lady. She couldn't persuade the august leaders at Harvard to give this bright woman a scholarship. She went out to the University of California, Berkeley, got a master's in laws, then went to my alma mater and got a JSD, a PhD, if you will, in law. And then became the first African-American woman as a priest in the Episcopal Church. The point being here is if you have it now, if you have courage now, if you have guts now, if you have moral imagination now, you can change the world now and in the future. That's what you have as students. Now, lest you believe that this is the kind of movement that is relegated to the senior citizen crowd, and I'm not picking on anybody, but people of my generation. Let me be clear with you that in every social justice movement, it's been about those who've had the temerity to step up. Some of you may recall a few weeks ago on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, an older congressman who stood beside a somewhat younger president. The congressman was Congressman John Lewis, who, when he was your age, wrote a letter to Martin Luther King. That letter went unanswered. He wrote another letter to Martin Luther King. Finally, he showed up. That being a lesson in and of itself. You can't tweet social change. You got to show up to bring about social change. But if you're still doubting this, let me share with you a lesson from the pages of the history of the NAACP. There was a field secretary of the NAACP by the name of Medgar Evers. Came home at the end of a long day, and because he was tired, because he was exhausted, he violated his own security protocols. His protocols dictated that when he exited a car, rather than get out on the driver's side, he was to get out on the passenger side. And in so doing, given the way he parked his car, it would afford him more protection from people who threatened his life on a daily basis. But being tired, being exhausted, he got out of his car on the driver's side. And an assassin with a deer rifle fired bullets into his body, bullets into his life, bullets into his legacy. And yet, as he lay dying, his words were these: "Sit me up and loose me." The question I have for you as student, as faculty, and as administrators today is, if Medgar Evers on his deathbed said, "Sit me up," what do we do in our living, in the midst of our lives? We have to stand up. Stand up for the right to vote. Stand up for income equality. Stand up for justice. Stand up for reform of the criminal justice system. Stand up for the principles, the precepts. Stand up for justice in our midst. Justice today, justice now, and being creators of history. That's what we have to do. Last note here. If we go back to that first Reconstruction, there was a former slave who was also an abolitionist by the name of Frederick Douglass. And he lifted up these words: "There's no progress without struggle. Those who profess to favor freedom yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the sea without the roar of its mighty waters. There can be no progress without struggle." I say to you today that we have to struggle in order to bring about progress. We have to struggle as students, as faculty, as administrators, as common Americans in this common struggle. We can't give in. We can't give up. We can't give over. We have to stand against injustice day in and day out, and we have to write our own history. And if you do, as you've been taught to do, you will do so. Thank you.
So I know it's Thursday, but I felt like I just went to church again. So, right. Thank you so much, Mr. Brooks. So we do have, I'd say about 8 to 10 minutes for questions. And I know that there are mics around the floor here. There's room with Rudy. And okay, so if you have a question, if you could stand up, and then once I point you out, and then I'll get out of the way because I don't have anything that good to say. We have one up in the front here. Wait for me.
You talked a lot about voting rights. Where do you see education in the, because that's where NAACP particularly historically has made its biggest mark, I think. And where do you see it today with charter schools and things like that?
Sure. You're precisely right. I mean, if there's anything that the NAACP is known for, it's been the fight we've led in terms of the desegregation of primary and secondary schools, also higher education. That being said, over the course of a generation, the conversation about educational excellence has been a conversation largely divided along the fault lines of for charter schools or being against charter schools. Left out of that discussion are these discussions. What do we do about the overwhelming majority of children who, no matter how many lotteries we have for charter school opportunities, who are left behind? What do we do about that brutally efficient preschool to prison pipeline? What do we do about the lack of access to high quality courses and challenging courses for students who well have the capabilities? What do we do about the internal tracking? The point being here is just because the conversation is not merely about the color arrangement of children in the classroom and not merely about resources, we have to then get to the tough questions about how to bring about educational excellence in the context of schools that are often segregated. And they're segregated largely as a consequence of continuing segregation in the housing market. I mean, one of the challenges that we have in this country is we will have conversations about segregation in public schools as though it is unrelated to segregation in the private housing market. And these two things go together. So the NAACP has done several things that I think speak to this. One, we've looked at the school-to-prison pipeline all across the country, and we've worked in places like Florida to bring about statutory and regulatory change to get rid of these zero-tolerance policies. Why is that? Because when you have these school-to-prison pipelines, when kids are criminalized, when they are thrown out of school for essentially common everyday adolescent behavior, that's a fast track into the alternative school system, which is a fast track to the juvenile justice system, which is a fast track to the criminal justice system. We have to address that, and we are doing that both at the federal level, at the state level, and the municipal level. The Attorney General's policy between the Department of Justice and Department of Education, the guidance they issued in terms of the school-to-prison pipeline, had the handprint and the fingerprints of the NAACP all over it. Two, in terms of the whole issue of school funding and school financing equity, that's an ongoing fight of the NAACP all across this country. Because while we're spending more for education, that doesn't always mean we're spending wisely for education, nor does it mean that we are ensuring that the kids are getting high-quality coursework and teachers and resources based upon school financing formulas. So I don't know as much about Pennsylvania as I do New Jersey, but when you cross the line over into New Jersey, what you see there is a formula for school financing that is profoundly, and I say that with great love for Garden State, profoundly backward. And we see more segregation in many instances in the North than we do in the Deep South, with the financing inequities that go with that. So fighting school financing formulas at the grassroots level, the school-to-prison pipeline. Thirdly, the NAACP is right now exploring a partnership with some of our friends in the business community around helping our kids have access to high-quality, challenging courses. One of the things that I think is very interesting is when you have teachers pick the students who are qualified to take challenging courses, what you find is sometimes they don't pick fairly. What's interesting is when you allow students to pick the courses they think they're qualified for, they perform better and they're better prepared for college. And so we stand for the proposition that we've always stood for, which is we believe in an inclusive meritocracy. Let the people with the gifts, the abilities rise to the top. give them the opportunity. So those are some of the things we're working on. Okay, here and then here. Very much so. So if you look at the degree to which public schools are segregated, we are about where we were in 1967. Now, 2015. So there's a great deal of segregation in our public schools, a great deal of segregation, I should say, a great deal of racial disparity that's manifested in the achievement gap. So I find it interesting that you can have children who, African American children, Latino children, who may be somewhat behind when they enter school, but that gap grows rather than decreases as they proceed through school. That's an issue. And so my point being is the segregation is not only manifested in terms of the color composition in the classroom, but more poignantly and more painfully with respect to the analytic capability of our children as they proceed through the public school system. So yes. I'm sorry, you, and then. Now, my dear colleagues, what you just heard is the beauty of the NAACP, which is to say we have 2,100 or so branches all across the country and about 5 military installations abroad. And anywhere you go, you just as likely hear from the president back in Baltimore, that would be me, or the president right here. So this is the great thing about the association, is we do work at a very, very local level as well as at a federal level.
Actually, one last question.
Yeah.
I had a question about NAACP's role in promoting greater equity among the teaching force along class, race, gender lines.
Yeah.
And then my follow-up was about restorative practices in public schools.
Okay.
Thank you.
And by restorative practices, I just want to make sure, like restorative justice?
Restorative justice
Yeah,
practices.
Sure.
in
So,
schools.
2 things. As you know from the history of the NAACP, many of our most significant cases alongside Brown and even before Brown had everything to do with ensuring the equity in hiring of African American teachers. So I'm saying that that fight goes back, way back. And across the country, at the local level, and certainly at the state level, we continue to push for diversity with respect to race and gender in the public schools in terms of hiring and resourcing. In terms of the question around restorative justice, I'm assuming you're referring to like community courts, youth courts. Let me make sure.
Non-traditional pedagogies used in schools
Okay.
have been found to be effective with minority students.
Yeah. So the answer to those questions are yes, yes, and yes. But I'd also say to you, I'd love for us to explore doing more, right? And here's what I mean. Sometimes some strategies are good at preventing bad things, less good at ensuring good things. Some of the things that you're talking about that are beyond curative, I think we could do more of. And we'd love to do more of it, and certainly love to talk with you more about that.
Well, I think that we should give Mr. Brooks another round of applause. I believe that this program was truly in the spirit of the Executive in Residence program and the Nerney Leadership Institute. This was just educational, this was informative, this was motivational, this was really that kind of, that servant leadership. We really have seen that through your time here, and I know we'll see that as you continue with your time here on campus. So I'm gonna sum up just really quickly because faculty have a meeting to get to. Where we have other voting to do. So, but what I heard here and what I think we've experienced this week and are going to continue to experience this week, because this is Unity Week, is really a rallying of voices and a rallying of forces. And And the NAACP has long led that charge in rallying people to the cause. And social justice issues are so directly related to the Cabrini College educational experience and the Missionary Sisters, but also deeply rooted in civil rights organizations like the NAACP. And you speak of reconstructions. I'm a historian of both of those reconstructions. And both of those reconstructions, one of the hallmarks of both of those reconstructions were that they were collaborative, they were interracial, they were interfaith, they were interregional, and they were intergenerational and interstrategic, right? So NAACP has a long history of fighting through the courts and a storied history of really affecting social change and social justice through the courts and through the schools and through so many dynamic, big structural issues. And there are organizations that are also at that grassroots level engaged in nonviolent direct action, engaged in just community rallying. And what I want us all to think about as you talk about this third reconstruction is, where's our gift? Where's our talent? Where do we see our efforts? And it doesn't have to be one agency, it can be multiple agencies, but it has to be focused on social justice and equality, and it has to be brought forth in a collaborative effort. And I thank you, Mr. Brooks, for giving us your knowledge, for showing us the beauty of collaboration, and for being really in the line of the great leaders of the NAACP. So thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you.